Well, hello, hello, hello. Much love to you all. May God bless you all. Smash that like button, share this out. We are going to go over a word that I believe a lot of Christians fear, and that word is Torah. I think a lot of people overlook because they just look at it as law, but we miss something here. There's missing of the multiple meanings of the word. So, where we get Torah or
Strong's H 8451, Torah, Torah.
Torah, we get it from the word law here. And, living in our society, speed limit's 55 miles per hour. Let's say you go over 55, you've broken the law. And people will focus on the law of the world. But then when they hear the word law in the Bible, it's like, I don't really know if I want to look at this. Even though the meaning can mean law, it also means teaching or instruction. I mean, as you see here, instruction, direction for a human or divine, instruction, a body of prophetic teaching, instruction in the messianic age. Um, I mean, just numerous types of, instead of just looking at law, which 90% of people look at it just law, they miss out on everything else. And it actually comes from a root word that we see.
Strong's H 3384, Yara, Yara.
So you got Torah and Yara, and it comes from the root word where we get teach. And it can mean many other things too, but teach or teacher, instructed. But mainly that's what I wanted to focus on there because it means something here. This word shows up a lot of times throughout the Bible. 222 times in the Old Testament, this word pops up. And when we look at a word like this, it's important. It's popped up a lot, whole lot. First time was in Genesis 26, verse 5. But I want to jump to Deuteronomy 4:44. And this is the law which Moses set before the children of Israel. So we have an introduction to a major section of the book here. This is the law or the Torah that Moses set before the Israelites. And what is it? I mean, it was a bunch of decrees and statutes and ordinances after they came out of Egypt. Egypt is the world. That's what we interpret Egypt as, the world. You come out of bondage to the world and you come in to the covenant with the Lord God Almighty. Then, of course, we get to Deuteronomy 5, where it gives you the 10 Commandments. Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, which we've talked about before. And then we get Deuteronomy 7 through 26, where there's this long set of regulation and laws dealing with topics like worship, uncleanliness, leaders, violence, honesty, property, which honestly, if you look even at the American law system, we have a lot of things that are based upon this with leaders, violence, property, retribution, if you go to court systems. So at first glance, we look at these like legal material, but really it's God gives commandments that fit into the broad category of requirements of laws and rules. But if we look closer, we see it's actually instructions and teachings. And many Bible scholars closely relate this word to teach instead of just law, because, like I said, it comes from the root word here. On several occasions, we see, for instance, let me go to the book of Psalm 27, verse 11. It says, teach me, which is yara, the root word from Torah, teach me thy way, O Lord, and lead me in a plain path because of mine enemies. So it's interesting here because we see that there's so many things that God talked about throughout the Bible, so many things that are key that people simply just overlook. And possibly it is because of fear that people overlook some of these things in the Bible. I mean, let's look at Deuteronomy 33:10. They shall teach Jacob thy judgments and Israel thy law. They shall put incense before thee and whole burnt sacrifice upon thine altar. So we see that it is the priests, they bore this responsibility for teaching the people God's way. They shall teach the people God's way. So when we look at Torah, we need to look at it as teaching instead of law, because it is a teaching. Because when we look at law, we're typically involved with criminal actions, and God's not putting out like the 10 Commandments as it's a criminal action. He's putting it out as a standard. Yeah, books like Deuteronomy contain many things that don't fit the definition. People will look at Deuteronomy and say, this is like criminal law being talked about. No, that's not what Deuteronomy is teaching here. Deuteronomy is teaching holiness. The Torah is teaching holiness. It's teaching, God's standards. So some people will look way past the 10 Commandments and will forbid people to even look at it. And that's kind of what's happening with society. We want to ignore these things. Well, for instance, let's look at Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 5, verse 21. It says, neither shalt thou desire thy neighbor's wife, neither shalt thou convey thy neighbor's house, his field, or his manservant, or his maidservant, his ox, or his ass, or anything that is thy neighbor's. Okay, this is still very important today. I mean, let's say, take for instance, your neighbor buys a brand new car, and you're like jealous about it. You want it. You start like daydreaming about it. You are conveying. This is unhealthy type of relationship. Now, people who obey this will have a much easier time with things like where the Bible is teaching us not to commit adultery or theft. But the Bible does tell us about what happened when people refused this. And yes, punishment did happen. If God is a just God, punishment does need to happen. But he's also a gracious God. That's why he's written out instructions for us to understand things. So, why would anyone just want to look at this as law? Of course, when you get to Deuteronomy 6:5, it says, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. Heart is lave, soul is nephesh. We've taught these, and Christ speaks about this as well. Christ used this same thing. This is not, this commandment is not about what is legal and more, faithfulness. It's a teaching about how to get your life right, and not a law linking a forbidden action to a in particular punishment that had come your way. This is to remind you, the Shema, to get your mind focused on the things that matter. And once we look at God's Torah, his teachings, as teachings and less as laws, we find that many things in this really aren't laws. We find that it's actually more about motivating people to obey. So, the book of Deuteronomy calls people to remember that they were slaves in Egypt and rescued by God. Well, same today. We were once bond servants, slaves to the world and sin. Now we have been freed in Christ. It's very important to look at it in this type of aspect. And then it also reminded them, because you were slaves at once, do not mistreat people that come amongst you. See, God educates us on what we should do and how we should do it. And the Old Testament is very overlooked by a lot of people in the faith, which is sad. Because we even see there's examples of Rahab. the Canaanite prostitute who ends up becoming part of God's people. Deuteronomy 4 provides more examples. As we go to Deuteronomy 4, verse 25 through 27, it says, "When thou shalt beget children and children's children, and ye shall have remained long in the land, and shall corrupt yourselves and make a graven image, or the likeness of anything, and shall do evil in the sight of the Lord thy God, to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that ye shall soon utterly perish from off the land, whereunto ye go over Jordan to possess it. Ye shall not prolong your days upon it, but shall utterly be destroyed. And the Lord shall scatter you among the nations, and ye shall be left few in number among the heathen, whither the Lord shall lead you." So sadly, people really didn't waste much time. If you go all the way to the book of Judges, this happens. They start following pagan god after pagan god and soon forgetting the truth. You know, then we go from King David to Solomon, who massively turns to many pagan gods. And we start seeing that what God spoke about here started coming to pass. They didn't die immediately. They weren't immediately forced off the land. It was many generations. And punishment finally came. God's instructions correctly warn us of the dangerous consequences that will come. You can live in the sin that you're in for an X amount of time, but consequence will hit. Sin is like a credit card. You enjoy now, you pay later. So we get one of the most final examples throughout the Bible. And it's actually in Psalm 119, the longest chapter in the Bible, where the whole thing is about one thing: how wonderful God's Torah is. So if we translate it as law, then it'd be difficult to relate to this. Because, for instance, we would get to verse 18: "Open thou mine eyes, that I may behold wondrous things out of thy law." So somebody would be proud of bad cases of legalism? No. Teachings. When we translate it as instructions or teachings, this makes more sense. "Open thou mine eyes, that I may behold wondrous things out of thy instructions, out of thy teachings." What's funny is in today's world, they have no problem watching shows like all Law and Order or cop shows where cops are bad cops, and they fantasize and imagine things like, "Oh, this is awesome, this person's wonderful." But if we bring up the law of God, people immediately manifest. This word Torah can relate to legal material. The translation of law doesn't fit with all the words what we see through the Old Testament. Actually, 90% of the time, especially the longest chapter in the book, you see law mentioned so many times. Actually, majority of the times that it is mentioned through the Old Testament, it is mentioned in Psalm 119. And he's not putting this here as some like, oh, no, it's instruction and teaching. That's how we need to look at it. Because when we look at just one single mindset, to say, I don't want to read it because it's law. I don't want to read it because it's law. How much do we benefit when we don't read the word in whole? When we don't get some kind of clear and instructive teaching out of it to better our lives? And that's what the Bible is about, to better your life so that you are more equipped to being a servant of God and to keep your eyes on the prize, Jesus Christ. May God bless you all. Hit that like button. Thank you for listening to this. Until we meet again, Lord willing, you fight from victory, not from defeat. And that is thanks to Jesus who saved you out of Egypt.